All right, we're going to be moving on. We have another panel that we're going to be bringing out here. I will be soon turning things over to Natasha Mascarenhas, who is a reporter at TechCrunch covering early-stage startups. She's also a host of TechCrunch's VC-focused podcast called Equity. And joining Natasha on stage, we have our panelists. We have Matt Glotzbach, CEO of Quizlet. We have Kat Kennedy, President and CXO of Degreed, and we have Christine Cruzvergara from Handshake, and they will be discussing transforming digital learning worldwide. And so, without further ado, please welcome Natasha and our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us through a super exciting day. I promise I'm going to make this really exciting because we have 3 unicorns in the room joining us on this stage. Thank you all for being here, and congratulations on the success so far. Very weird to not see any of you on Zoom right now. Well, I want to start off by letting you all introduce yourselves, and then we'll get to, I promise, some spicy questions about challenges and opportunities ahead. I'll throw it to you first, Matthew.
Sure, thank you. I'm Matt Glotzbach. I'm the CEO of Quizlet. Quizlet's a direct-to-consumer global studying platform. We serve over 70 million users on a monthly basis and help them practice and master whatever it is they're learning.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Cruzvergara. I'm the Chief Education Strategy Officer at Handshake, and we're the largest early career network helping over 8 million students launch their careers.
And I'm Kat Kennedy. I'm President and CXO at Degreed. We are an upskilling platform that gives individuals a way to represent their skill, no matter how it's attained. And we help organizations to understand the skills of their employees and help to build skills in the event that there's a gap with the work that needs to be done.
I love it. So obviously, all 3 of you are working with very different kinds of learners, but the definition of learner changed so much over the past 12 months, 18 months, and I'm sure is changing as we speak. And so I wanted to start really looking back at what surprised you and what kind of you weren't prepared for when the pandemic first hit, namely around this idea of something had to have been broken or not ready within each of your companies. I'll be honest. And so what was that broken or missing insight that you now have as leaders of your companies? I'll let you go first, Matthew.
How much time do you have? So we, at Quizlet, we're a direct-to-consumer study platform. So in a lot of ways, we were well-positioned when, as things went crazy and went virtual and whatnot. From a product perspective, so we weren't dependent on the schools,
Sure.
and the districts, and all that good stuff. So that actually went pretty well. I think what we saw, and kind of obvious looking back, is how critical kind of student motivation and student empowerment and student engagement is. And that, like I said, in hindsight, that sounds so blatantly obvious, but you start to realize very quickly the role that educators and those peer support networks and the things that students have in middle school, high school, college, how critical they were to help students be successful, get engaged. And the pandemic took all of those things away, and students were really required to be very self-directed and self-learning. And so recognizing that and then figuring out, okay, what can we do more in our product and our platform to help encourage that when you take away some of those support structures?
Sure. And Christine, I know, the name of your company suddenly was dated, right? Handshake. No such thing as handshakes anymore. How did you kind of find yourself responding? Was it similar? You were trying to realize that the students you were working with would now have to be even more present on the platform, or what were some of the surprising things that showed up for you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. So much about college recruiting has always been in person. Right? Employers show up on campus, they meet you at a physical career fair, they do on-campus interviewing, and all of a sudden, all of that was gone. And we had to figure out new ways for students and employers to really connect, but also in a way that was still meaningful, in a way that meant something to them and didn't just feel transactional. And so even though we're a virtual platform and we were, of course, already moving towards virtual strategies with our employers, we had anticipated that it would take maybe 3 to 5 years before that really took hold with the majority, and all of a sudden everything got condensed down to 3 to 5 months, and we had to move very quickly and sort of pivot to figure out how do we develop strong methods and manners for students and employers to be able to get connected in a meaningful way virtually.
With Degreed, I think there's been so much competition in my inbox, in the headlines, raising money, Degreed included, really finding a lot of tailwinds. How, looking back, were you prepared to handle kind of so much of a spotlight and so many new people being, we want to do the same thing, we want to get into reskilling, and we want to make sure our workforces are ready?
Yeah, you look to the day when you've made a category so successful that others catch on to it. That's really something you aspire to as a startup. And so I see it as a good sign that the market is understanding the value that we provide enough that others have caught on and are hoping to emulate. And I believe that the ecosystem is actually richer as we collaborate together. So rather than competition, I think it's co-opetition. You know, how can we all collaborate together and have 1 + 1 = 3? So the more technologies and partners that enter the space, I think the more brilliant minds we have that can collaborate together and in the end serve the individuals. And for Degreed, where we focus is empowering individuals inside the walls of the enterprise. And I think that is something that Degreed works very hard at, but we always are lucky to do it with partners as well.
Just to follow up on that directly, this idea of now being in a position to be acquiring some of your competition or be acquiring some of your compliments, I'm curious how you even begin thinking about where to start right now when it comes to connecting the dots, because disagree with me, please, but it does feel like EdTech is finally getting to a place where it can afford to connect dots between companies much more. It doesn't have to build everything in-house. How do you start itching and knowing which company to even look at to scoop up?
Yeah, I think the first is being aware of what's going on in the ecosystem. My favorite part about being here together with all of you is learning about what's going on and what you're building and the opportunities that you see. And it's really in those conversations that the spark is ignited. We've done 3 acquisitions now at Degreed, hope to do many more as we continue on. And across each of those, they started with a conversation, with us noticing something special about individuals or about an organization and thinking through the opportunities that could come to pass if we were combined.
Matthew, you mentioned kind of this realization and pressure around self-directed learners. And I wanted to spend, a few minutes with all of you around how much pressure we should be putting on students right now and where we draw the lines around what they should be doing by themselves, what they should be doing with an AI-powered tutor, what they should be thinking about before they sleep and when they wake up in the morning. I feel like we ask a lot. So maybe starting with Quizlet, how have you been thinking about where your product needs to live and how to get your product not being used sometimes too? That feels healthy.
It's funny, we don't talk much about that. No, well, I think it's important to point out that none of these things are new. So COVID maybe has shined a bright light on those realities, but they existed pre-pandemic. We just weren't talking about them or weren't focused on them, right? I would argue that to be a successful student today, whether that's in middle school, high school, post-secondary, et cetera, you have to be really self-directed. You have to take matters, kind of into your own hands. And that obviously, historically, that's evolved as you've gone, in middle school, you're very teacher-directed, right? In high school, sort of that transition point where you start to become more self-directed and you move into college and postgraduate and into your career, and you become very, you have to be fully self-directed. But that trend has been accelerating and that requirement has been there. And so I think the role of technology is how do we give students of all ages, whether they be, grade school kids or adult learners, the tools to be as effective and successful as possible. But I think to your point, it doesn't mean move everything online, make everything a digital experience. If anything, the pandemic has shown us the criticality of human connection, right? Technology can only take us, I think we've all commented how nice it is to actually be in person and see people.
It's weird.
We've met each other a number of times, but only over Zoom,
right.
And so I think that's an important check of the role that technology can play is as a facilitator and enabler, but it doesn't replace the educator. It doesn't replace the human connection and community.
If I can ask for an example around a time or moment where Quizlet was like, we could do this, but we're not going to, so we don't, try and tech everything. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, we we focus on really the student studying and learning. So anytime that we talk about how can we empower students or educators, but never how do we replace them. So we never have conversations about, oh, well, this would take the place of having an educator or a teacher. Like that's not part of the conversation, because we recognize we instead have the conversation of how can we use technology to empower the teacher, right? How can we give an educator more insights into what the students are doing at home when they're studying? How can we give the students more insights themselves into what they're doing and motivate them with studying? So it's about that, empowerment and enablement, but not replacement of the human.
Yeah, Christine, as Chief Education Strategy Officer, I'm really curious how realistic you think it is to expect students to be, online supplementally learning and going through the motions, all for this greater good of eventually getting a job or making their way to another platform. You get a look at them as they're kind of really in this specific spot of trying to get their first job. And so I'm wondering what you're seeing from them and what kind of attitude and energy you get.
Yeah, so we're actually seeing students in particular, even though many of them want to be back in person for social reasons, they want to be back in person for some of the learning and those components, over a majority of students actually want to stay virtual when it comes to recruiting. And so that's actually been really interesting. We did a report recently where we found that over 60%, particularly of Black students, Latinx students, and women students were more interested in continuing their virtual recruiting or they're recruiting virtually because they felt more seen and they were more likely to then apply. And so I think that's actually been really interesting, is when we're talking about Zoom fatigue or we're talking about how students want to engage, it's not all or nothing. We have to actually start getting more nuance now in parsing out what is that experience and what does that look like, where can they really benefit, and how does that fit into their schedules? Because the reality is virtual allows them more flexibility, it allows them to be more prepared, it allows them to be more scheduled in some ways, which you're going through a process of a job search which is already so anxiety-ridden for most students because they don't know what that process is like. So I think that's been really interesting to see.
Well, and if I can build on that, I think that's such a great point. When we think about the traditional classroom education, again, whether it be secondary or post-secondary, that same idea applies, which is how do we best leverage the time that we have together, right? Maybe the best use of time when you have a group of students in a class isn't one person on stage lecturing out to them, but maybe it's actually small group discussion, maybe it's interaction, maybe it's project work, because you can do those other things remotely or virtually, right? And so my hope that the pandemic allows us at every level in education to take a step back and say, are we best utilizing the time we have? Maybe we don't take the time in person for granted anymore, but we think about how to best utilize that time.
And I think the individual learners expect it. What the pandemic has done is it's shown the potential of flexibility and has made us question so much of what was status quo. And that's not just for those of us who are creating technologies and facilitating, but it's very true for the individuals, and their expectations have changed. And no longer will they go along, they are demanding that we adapt, that we come up with something new so that they are better served.
I want to push on that a little bit because I think the fact of the status quo changing is probably the most inspiring part of EdTech, when we're not just supporting the same tests being weighed the same way. And Kat, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to how employers are changing their mindset beyond what we see in stories, even on TechCrunch. What are we not covering? What are we not talking about that's changing? Are employers starting to say that we will value employees the same if they were, in person or virtual? How can we kind of make sense of what they're changing?
Yeah, I think the reality that so many organizations are facing right now, whether it was, as things became very real and immediate when the pandemic hit, it was affecting their bottom line. And there's nothing like a crisis to really make you stop and pay attention.
Yeah.
And so I'm lucky to get to work with so many innovative HR and business leaders, but across the board, what we're seeing is an immediate, it's no longer just a nice to have, it's no longer an idea that could be a someday. They needed to address this immediately, and it didn't stop there. That was just making sure people were equipped to deal with the constantly changing circumstances. But now individuals know they have choice. They know they can leave. And organizations know they can't have that happen because their people are their number one resource. And so it's a beautiful time to be in ed tech because it is a mission critical problem. And organizations who historically may have said, oh yes, learning, how nice. Isn't it nice to be developing people? Now it is a CEO level imperative that the people have the skills, but also that they know they are being invested in. Because if I am not growing, I will go somewhere where I can be. And so it's been a silver lining to this whole situation is now the conversation is happening at all of the right places inside the organization to move them forward in a way that 10 years ago, it felt like we were singing and preaching from a soapbox on, you should care, you really should. And now they're like, we care, help. And so that's been one of the silver linings through this whole situation, and I feel lucky to get to support them in their journeys.
Yeah, I think as employees feel more empowered, we see a lot of people obviously resigning and changing their teams and asking for more. When you're building a product, though, how do you respond to that sort of empowerment while also trying to keep the employers happy? I'm obviously probably asking the question that you guys are built to solve, but I mean, how much are you changing the way that you build at Degreed to now be more, I guess, because you can now listen to employees because the employers themselves will spend money on it?
That's the soapbox that we were on, is that at the end of the day, if you are not serving the individual, and for us it's an employee, that's the context that they are in, they're not going to care. They have lives, they have jobs, they are busy. And if you're just telling them, you need to care about this, no, think of yourself in your own situation. If you're being told to care and you are not served, you're not going to do it. And so from the beginning, we had a staunch approach that we must bring value to individuals through the technologies that we provide, and we cannot lose sight of serving those individuals and bringing them value, or else there's no value that ultimately we could bring to the enterprise. And so early on, the partners that were actually purchasing us and willing to go on a startup journey were those that bought in, that as we serve individuals and help them to develop and to grow, it is the enterprise that is served at the end of the day. So we were lucky in that that was one of our staunch planted flags. What's beautiful about this moment is now we are not alone in that approach, that both technologies and organizations and universities understand that the ultimate stakeholder at the end of the day is the learner. And how can we help to serve them? Because as we do so, it's going to rising tide will lift all boats, if you will.
I love it. It's a perfect segue into a conversation about access and specifically the digital divide. I myself think I saw it turn into a digital divide amongst hardware to a digital divide amongst software over the past year. And I'm wondering, as founders, as directors and executives of these massive companies, do you feel like the digital divide is getting better or worse than it was before the pandemic? Matthew, I'll start with you and then we can go in order.
It's a good question. I think, so first of all, I might challenge the premise. I actually don't want to dismiss the hardware and connectivity access issue. I think, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic again, a bright light shone on a problem that has existed, continues to exist. We actually published a data report from our own data about looking at usage patterns, study patterns, and devices that people were on, and then correlated that with incomes by zip code, and saw that in lower income areas, you saw a lot more cell phone usage versus in higher income areas, you saw a lot more laptop and iPad type usage. And so, we've all seen the New York Times story of the kid sitting in a McDonald's parking lot on a cell phone trying to do their homework. So I do think there is a software issue, but I don't want to dismiss. I still think there's a hardware and a high-speed internet access issue. On the software side, I think it's critical to understand that it's there. we obviously have to balance building great products that are accessible to everyone and having a business model. And so I think it starts with that awareness and understanding. It starts with having a very diverse and inclusive employee base and thinking about all aspects. I think one of the historical challenges is that you get a lot of very well-intentioned, very principled, sort of from elite colleges, founders who go and build ed tech for themselves, but they don't have a perspective on the rest of the world that needs that technology. I do think that's changing, and it's changing very rapidly, and that's a good thing. But I do think it's still an issue, and I think it's something we need to keep an eye out. What I would love to see, if anyone's out there looking to start a company, what I would love to see is, wouldn't it be great if there was an API or similar that as ed tech companies we could call for effectively financial aid, right? The equivalent of free and reduced lunch in K through 12 to say, hey, this person has a needs-based sort of access to this technology, and therefore they should be able to get it at a discount, or they should be able to get it for free, or something like that. So I think there's a recognition of the real problems that are out there, and I'm confident that where there's a problem, that innovation will go and work to solve it. But we have to continue to keep that conversation at the forefront and not push it under the rug.
Yeah, Christine, I'm wondering if you agree. Like, who do you think should be the person that's changing or doing most of the work around the digital divide and I guess lessening the divide to begin with?
Yeah, well, first, I could not agree more with everything that Matthew said. Literally, almost my answer. Said so beautifully. I think the hardware issue, first and foremost, is actually still a huge issue for a lot of college students. When you look at the number of college students who live in rural areas, some of the college students who have families where they might have been living with many siblings or extended family, they weren't able to even get access to the Wi-Fi that they needed to be able to then have the software issues, right? And I think that alone is a really big responsibility that, for me, I believe institutions such as colleges and universities need to be paying attention to, and they need to think about how they are using some of their funding to be able to actually channel that towards Wi-Fi hotspots, broadband access, so on and so forth. Obviously, I do believe our government plays a huge role in that, and I think as companies and as founders and as executives, we have a role to play in those conversations to really help push that forward. I think when it comes to the software piece, it's always about, there's always going to be an element of education and learning and how to even use said software, and there's always going to be a divide around exposure and who's used to this, who already knows this. In our case, what's really difficult is the job search process literally changes all the time. And so for many students, even if they have families who have gone through the job search process of 15 years ago or 20 years ago does not look the same as it does right now. And so using any software, Handshake included, comes with it a large learning curve that students have to sort of figure out on their own. So we feel that we have the responsibility to figure out better wayfinding within our product so that it is a little bit easier and it takes some of that pressure and that anxiety away for students.
Well, and if I can just build on one point you said, which is, or you alluded to, which is, I think we all have this fairly distorted view of what a college student is anymore, right? So we think of college, and you think of the 18 to 22-year-old who graduates from high school and goes off to a 4-year on-premise campus experience, et cetera. That is not, you all know, that's not the reality of college in America or college worldwide anymore, right? The average age of a student is 25. 70% of college students go to community colleges or state schools. 25% of college students have kids of their own and are supporting families. 30% are working, or 40% are working 30 hours a week or more, basically full-time jobs while also going to college. So, just like you're talking about, the job search process has changed dramatically in the last decade or two, so too has the reality of the college student, the secondary school experience. But I think we still think about it in the traditional sense. And so the whole mindset around what it means to be a college student, quote unquote, needs to change, and the technologies with it, et cetera.
Yeah, I think when we provide services and technologies, we never serve people well when we make assumptions about their experience, and whether that experience is the technology, the hardware that they have access to, or assumed understanding of certain user experiences. If we assume too much, good things are not as readily to happen. And so it comes down to how can we gain more empathy, more understanding, and not be building things in isolation and in silos. I think that's a just inherent requirement of those of us who provide technologies, is that we must understand the people that we serve, and those people are complex and they are individuals, and a lot of times they don't look like us or have our same experiences. And if we're going to serve them well, we need to find a way to better understand them. And I think that's a requirement of technologists that often can go underappreciated.
Would you say that that feels like the next focus for EdTech, kind of getting into a reflection stage instead of an emergency response stage? Or do you think that there's something else that we should all be paying attention to right now, Kat?
I think there's so much opportunity. It's hard to pick one. I'm like, yes, and. But what I love about the moment that we're in is how we experience technology is changing so rapidly. Like, what does hardware mean? What does that mean when mixed with software? And how much longer will the browser be the way in which I experience things? Like, we are on this cusp of the next level of technology, and to me, that is where our mind should be, is what is that next level of experience? How can we be plugging into that so that we can better complete each of our jobs to be done with our products?
Do you mind if I jump in here? I think when we think about the future, I think the faster and better we can recognize just how large our ecosystem actually is, the stronger we can get. Because one of the big pieces, I used to work in higher education and now work in ed tech on the other side, and I think one of the things I've seen from both sides is how much things can get siloed. And the reality is we're stronger if we can identify each other's strengths and then actually play to that. And the larger we recognize the ecosystem, the more we can actually change systems.
I smell some amazing partnerships coming up for all three of you. Thank you all for spending so much time with me. We're just out of time, but we will let the conversation continue, I'm sure, in the rest of the conference. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.